In the Wyoming Territory, justice wasn't a lady holding scales. It was a man holding a rope. And in the town of Redemption Gulch, that rope was already being measured for Jane Finch. She was accused of murdering Jedediah Kane, the most powerful man for 100 miles around, and in the makeshift courtroom of the Gilded Cage Saloon, her fate was all but sealed. The air was thick enough to chew, a foul mix of stale beer, sweat, and the choking dust that was both the lifeblood and the curse of this town. Jane sat on a poker table, her hands bound tight. The jury was every drunk ranch hand and merchant who had ever bowed to the man she'd supposedly killed. The judge, Thaddeus Grimshaw, had a face like a tombstone, and he was ready to write her epitaph. The crowd was ready for a hanging, and nobody was coming to save her. But they were wrong about that. In just a few moments, the saloon doors were going to swing open. A man who was more ghost than human, a man whose name was a frightened whisper on the frontier, was about to walk in. He was going to face them all down, and he was going to tell a lie that would change everything. The heat of that August afternoon was a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread in Jane's gut. She looked at the hostile eyes staring back at her. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a show. Jedediah Kane had been the king of this dusty speck on the map. He owned the biggest ranch, the store, and most folks whispered he owned the sheriff, too. 3 days ago, he'd been found dead right at the edge of his property, just a stone's throw from the small homestead Jane had worked with her own 2 hands. A single clean hole from a .44 caliber bullet was in his chest. His own Colt Peacemaker was still snug in its holster. The accusation had come as fast as a lightning strike. Jane Finch was the perfect suspect. She was an outsider, a woman who'd shown up 2 years ago with just a mule, some tools, and a quiet grit the locals called arrogance. She kept to herself, and that made people nervous. Worse, she had told Jedediah Kane to his face to stay off her land. He wanted her creek, the last good water source he didn't control. He'd made offers, but they sounded more like threats. The whole town knew they were feuding. So when he turned up dead near her fence line, the conclusion was already written. Sheriff Brody Hicks, a man whose spine was made of jelly, led the posse. He'd found a single spent .44 casing on her property. It was the same caliber as the Winchester rifle she kept by her cabin door. He didn't bother looking for other tracks, other clues. He had his suspect, and for Redemption Gulch, that was good enough. Now, she faced the judge. His voice boomed, silencing the saloon's low murmur. Jane Finch, you stand accused of the willful murder of Mr. Jedediah Kane. The evidence is compelling. A known dispute, a witnessed threat, and the means to commit the act. How do you plead? Every eye was on her, hungry for the spectacle. She lifted her chin, her voice raspy but clear. Not guilty, Your Honor. A sneer came from the bar. It was Bartholomew Kane, Jedediah's son, a softer, crueler copy of his father. She's a liar. My father told me she threatened him. Said if he set foot on her land again, she'd put him in the ground. A chorus of agreement came from Kane's ranch hands, all eager to see the woman who defied their boss swing from a rope. I told him to stay off my property, Jane said, her gaze locked on the judge. That is the right of any landowner. A right you chose to enforce with a rifle, the judge shot back. No, I didn't shoot him. I was in my cabin all evening. I saw no one, heard nothing. No witnesses to confirm your whereabouts, of course, Judge Grimshaw said, as if driving the final nail in her coffin. A convenient solitude. Her heart sank. It was the truth. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. This trial wasn't a trial. It was a play they had to act out before the grisly final act. Sheriff Hicks wouldn't meet her eyes. Bartholomew sneered. The judge shuffled his papers, his mind already made up. Despair, cold and sharp, began to pierce through her. This was it. This was how her story ended. Framed for a murder in a dusty, God-forsaken town that had already condemned her. She closed her eyes, not praying for salvation, but for the strength to face the end with her head held high. That's when the saloon doors creaked open. The sound itself was nothing, but the sudden shift in the light was everything. A tall, long shadow fell across the floorboards, stretching like a dark finger toward the judge's table. The murmuring didn't just quiet down. It died. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Every man in the gilded cage saloon turned. Hands that had been holding beer mugs now drifted toward the pistols on their hips. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun, was a man who wasn't just a part of the landscape. He was a force of nature that passed through it. He was Lakota. But not just any Lakota. He was the one they spoke of in hushed tones around campfires, the subject of frightened whispers. The settlers had a name for him, one born of fear and rumor. Ghost Bear. His people called him Mato-Wanagi. He was tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of a wolf. He wore simple buckskins and a worn linen shirt. His face was a mask of hard-won severity, framed by two long, dark braids. But it was his eyes that captured the room. They were dark and piercing, moving with a deliberate slowness, assessing every man, every threat, with an unnerving calm. He carried no rifle, but a long-bladed knife was sheathed at his belt, and its presence felt more menacing than any firearm. He was a warrior who had not surrendered to the reservations, a phantom of the plains who still lived by the old ways. His presence this deep in settler territory was an unheard-of, terrifying event. He took one step into the room, then another. The floorboards groaned under his moccasins, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence. He paid no mind to the armed men, to the glowering face of Bartholomew Kane or the shocked sheriff. His gaze swept past them all until it landed on Jane. For a moment their eyes met. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew him. A memory, sharp and vivid from a year ago, a secret act of mercy she had never spoken of, rushed back to her. But why was he here? What could he possibly do? Mato-Wanagi's focus shifted to Judge Grimshaw. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the building. "This is your place of law?" he asked. The simple question sounded like an accusation. Judge Grimshaw, recovering his composure, puffed out his chest. "This is a court of the United States government. State your business, or be removed." Removed? A flicker of cold irony touched the Lakota's eyes. He gestured with his chin toward Sheriff Hicks, who looked like he'd rather wrestle a grizzly. "By him? What do you want?" Bartholomew Kane snarled, stepping forward. "This is white man's business. Get out." Mato-Wanagi ignored him, his attention locked on the judge. "I'm here for the woman," he said. "Jane Finch." The saloon erupted in a low, dangerous growl. "She's a murderer," Bartholomew shouted, "and she's going to hang for it." "She is accused," the judge corrected, though his tone made it a mere formality. "And her fate is a matter for this court, not for you." Mato-Wanagi took another slow step forward, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. He stopped in the center of the floor, a lone, unmovable rock in a river of hostility. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Her fate is not for you to decide. She cannot be tried by your law." Judge Grimshaw's face turned purple. "And why is that? Is she a citizen of the Lakota Nation?" The next words that came from Mato-Wanagi's mouth were the spark that lit the powder keg. He looked directly at Jane, a silent communication passing between them that she couldn't comprehend. Then, turning his gaze back to the stunned and furious judge, he delivered the lie. She is protected by the law of the people, he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Because she is my wife. The silence that followed was a living thing, heavier than the oppressive heat, deeper than the town's well. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Men who'd been ready to string Jane up stood frozen, their mouths agape. Bartholomew Kane's face, twisted with vengeful glee just a moment before, was now a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. Jane felt the world tilt. Wife. The word echoed in her mind, nonsensical and terrifying. She stared at the Lakota warrior, at the impossible audacity of his claim. It was a lie, a blatant, world-shattering lie. But why? Judge Grimshaw was the first to find his voice. Wife, that's preposterous. Absurd. There's no record, no license, no ceremony. Matowanagi turned his head slightly. Your records are not my records. Your ceremonies are not my ceremonies. He let the words hang in the air with profound disdain. Your laws are not my laws. He's lying, Bartholomew roared, finding his footing. He pointed a trembling finger at the warrior. He's a savage trying to protect a killer. Sheriff, arrest them both. Sheriff Hicks looked from the furious Kane heir to the imposing figure of Ghost Bear and seemed to shrink inside his uniform. He looked like a man being asked to pet a rattlesnake. Now hold on, Bartholomew. Matowanagi's gaze settled on Jane. Is what I say untrue? He asked, his dark eyes boring into hers. It wasn't just a question. It was a command, an instruction. In that instant, Jane understood. This was a lifeline, a desperate, insane gamble thrown to her from the most unexpected corner imaginable. To deny it was to accept the noose. To agree was to step off a cliff into an unknown abyss. He was offering her a shield forged from the town's own deepest fears. Her throat was dry as dust. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the hard, unforgiving eyes. She looked at the judge, whose verdict was already decided. She could almost feel the rope burn on her neck. Then she looked back at the man they called Ghost Bear. His expression was unreadable, but in the depths of his eyes, she saw a flicker of something. A promise. A debt being repaid. Taking a ragged breath, she found her voice. It was barely a whisper, but in the dead quiet of the saloon, it sounded like a cannon shot. It is true, she said, the lie tasting foreign and bitter on her tongue. He is my husband. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, their disbelief turning to outrage. She's lying to save her skin. Since when do we recognize Indian weddings? This is a mockery of the law. Judge Grimshaw slammed a whiskey bottle on the bar, using it as a gavel. Order! Order in this court! He bellowed, his face flushed with fury. This changes nothing. A claim made under duress with no proof. It is a desperate ploy, and it will not stand. It is not a ploy. Matowanagi's voice cut through the noise, calm and sharp as obsidian. It is Lakota law. A woman married to one of our people is under our protection. You touch her, you declare war on us. Is the life of one dead man worth that to you, Judge? He wasn't just talking to Grimshaw. He was talking to every man in that room. He was reminding them of the bloody frontier wars, of Custer's recent end at the Little Bighorn. He was invoking the deep-seated fear of an Indian war that haunted every isolated settlement. Redemption Gulch was a tiny speck in a vast wilderness, a wilderness that was still the domain of men like him. The judge paled. The threat, though unspoken, was brutally clear. To hang Jane now was to potentially sign the death warrant for the entire town. This is highly irregular, Grimshaw stammered, falling back on legal jargon to mask his uncertainty. There are treaties, jurisdictions. Your treaties are broken paper, Matowanagi said flatly. My word is not. I have made my claim. Now provide your proof that she killed this man. He turned his head, his piercing gaze sweeping over the crowd. Not your whispers, not your suspicions. Proof. Then he did something that stunned them all into another silence. He walked with the same deliberate, unhurried pace right through the crowd of hostile men who parted before him like the Red Sea. He walked to the poker table where Jane sat, and with two swift movements, he broke the cheap rope binding her wrists. The fibers snapped with a sharp crack. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply stood beside her, a silent, unmovable guardian. His presence had transformed the entire room. A moment ago, she was a lone woman at the mercy of a mob. Now she was under the protection of the most feared man in the territory. Jane rubbed her raw wrists, her mind reeling. The trial had been derailed. The certain verdict was shattered. But as she stood up, shaky and uncertain, beside the man who had just called her his wife, she knew this was far from over. It was just the beginning of a new and perhaps even more dangerous trial. The Gilded Cage Saloon was now a powder keg with a lit fuse. The men of Redemption Gulch were caught between their ingrained fear of the Lakota and their furious desire for retribution. Judge Grimshaw, flustered and outmaneuvered, saw his authority evaporating. He couldn't hang her, but he couldn't let her walk free either. The Kane family's influence was the bedrock of his power. He had to save face. "This court is recessed," he finally declared. "The prisoner, Jane Finch, will be remanded to the custody of Sheriff Hicks while this extraordinary claim is considered. We will reconvene tomorrow at noon." He glared at Matowanagi. "And you, your presence will be required." Matowanagi gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had won the first battle. He had bought time. "All right, you two," Sheriff Hicks said unhappily, gesturing with his pistol. "Let's go to the jailhouse." As they walked to the door, the crowd parted, their expressions a mixture of fear, hatred, and confusion. Jane could feel their eyes on her back. Before, she was just a murderer. Now she was something worse. She was a traitor to her own kind. The jailhouse was a squat, sun-baked wooden box with two small cells. Hicks locked Jane in one, the iron door clanging shut with a dreadful finality. He then turned to Matowanagi. "And you," the sheriff said, gesturing to the other cell. "You're not under arrest, but I can't have you wandering around. You'll stay here, for your own protection." Matowanagi looked at the cramped, filthy cell. Without a word, he stepped inside and sat on the hard-packed dirt floor, his back straight, his composure absolute. He did not look like a prisoner. He looked like a king holding court in a dungeon. The sheriff retreated to his office, leaving them in the dim, stifling heat. The silence was heavy. Finally, Jane spoke, her voice a low whisper across the narrow walkway. "Why? Why did you do that?" He was silent for a long moment. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A debt must be paid. By lying to a whole town and claiming me as your wife." A note of hysteria crept into her voice. "They'll kill you for this." "They are afraid," he stated simply. "Fear is a weapon. Today, I used it for you." Jane looked up, meeting his eyes through the bars. "They won't stay afraid forever. The judge will find a way around your claim. This has just delayed the inevitable." "Time is what you needed," he replied. "The truth does not run on a judge's schedule. It must be hunted." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You did not kill him." "It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact." "No," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. "I swear I didn't." "Then who did?" "I don't know. Jedediah Kane had enemies, plenty of them. Men he cheated, homesteaders he pushed off their land. It could have been anyone. But they chose you," Matowanagi said, "because you were alone. An easy story to tell." He shifted his position. Tell me about the man, the one who was killed." The words spilled out of her in a rush. She told him about Cain's relentless pressure, his threats. She told him about Bartholomew's sneering arrogance and the ranch hands who acted like they owned the whole territory. She described her homestead, the creek, the fence line where the body was found. He listened without interruption, his focus absolute. He was a hunter tracking a new kind of prey. The truth. "The shell casing the sheriff found," he said when she finished. "On your land. He showed it to you." "Yes," she nodded. "Ahoy. 44 from a Winchester," he said, "just like mine." "But not from yours," he countered. "A rifle fired leaves its own mark, like a footprint. No two are the same. Did the sheriff compare the casing to one fired from your rifle?" Jane's mind raced. "No, he just took my rifle and the casing. He said it was all the proof he needed." A long silence settled between them. From the office they could hear voices. Sheriff Hicks was talking to Bartholomew Kane. "Can't just let him get away with this, Sheriff." Kane's angry voice carried clearly. "An Indian walks in and tells a fairy tale, and you just roll over. My father deserves justice." "I'm handling it, Bartholomew," the sheriff's weary voice replied. "The judge is looking into it. We have to do this by the book." "The book?" Bartholomew scoffed. "There's no book for this. You should have run that savage out of town the second he showed his face." Mato Wanagi's expression didn't change, but Jane could feel a subtle sharpening of his attention. He was listening, gathering, his mind working far beyond the confines of his cell. She realized then what he had truly given her. It wasn't just a clever lie. He had given her an ally. The one man in the territory who wasn't intimidated by the Kane family's power. He was an outsider, just like her. But where her isolation was a weakness, his was a weapon. The weight of the lie they had told was immense, a fragile shield that could shatter at any moment. But for the first time since Jedediah Kane's body had been found, a tiny fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of Jane's despair. But this hope was tangled with a memory, a secret she had carried for a year, the very reason Ghost Bear was sitting in this cell. The memory was etched into her mind as sharply as a winter frost. It was from the previous year, during the wolf moon, when the snow lay deep and merciless across the plains. A blizzard had raged for 3 days. When it finally broke, leaving behind a pristine, silent world, Jane had ventured out to check her snares. It was near the frozen creek, half hidden in a snowdrift, that she found him. At first, she thought it was a dead wolf, a dark shape against the stark white. But then she saw the human form. It was Mato Wanagi. She knew who he was. Every settler did. Ghost Bear, the phantom of the plains. The stories said he was a ruthless warrior. She should have been terrified. She should have turned and run. But he was clearly dying. His leg was mangled, caught in a rusty, long-abandoned bear trap, the steel teeth buried deep in his flesh. A dark, frozen stain of blood blossomed in the snow around him. He was barely conscious, but his eyes, when they fluttered open, still held a defiant fire. Compassion, a force more powerful than fear, took hold of her. She saw not a feared warrior, but a fellow human being at the mercy of the brutal wilderness they both called home. Getting him out of the trap was a nightmare. She had to use a sturdy branch as a lever, putting her entire weight against the rusted springs, her muscles screaming in the frigid air. He made no sound, though the pain must have been excruciating. Once he was free, she half dragged, half carried him back to her small sod cabin, her lungs burning with every step. Inside, she laid him on her own cot. The wound was horrific. The leg was broken, the flesh torn and blackened with frostbite. By all rights, he should lose it, if he didn't die of infection first. For the next week, her cabin became a secret hospital. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and the last of her precious whiskey. She used her sewing needles to stitch the torn flesh, and she set the bone as best she could, splinting it with boards from a broken crate. He drifted in and out of consciousness, delirious with fever. In his lucid moments, he just watched her, his dark eyes following her every move. They spoke no common language. Their communication was one of gestures and shared understanding. She risked everything for him. If anyone from town had shown up, they would both have been doomed. Harboring a hostile was a death sentence. On the 8th day, his fever broke. He woke up, his eyes clear for the first time. He sat up, looked at his splinted leg, and then at her. He spoke then, his voice low and raspy in his own tongue. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was gratitude. He stayed for 2 more weeks, slowly regaining his strength. He was a quiet guest. One day, using his long-bladed knife, he carved a small, intricate feather from a piece of wood. The day he left was as sudden as his arrival. He stood, testing his weight on the healing leg. He walked to the door and turned to her. He pressed the small wooden feather into her palm and closed her fingers around it. Then he spoke again, a single phrase in his language. He repeated it, pointing to himself, then to her, making a gesture that seemed to bind them together. It was a promise, a vow. Then he was gone, melting back into the landscape. She had hidden the wooden feather away, a memento of her secret. Now, sitting in the jail cell, she understood. The lie he had told was not born of thin air. It was his interpretation of the vow he had made in her cabin. He had promised her his protection, and in his culture, that was a bond as strong as any marriage. He was repaying his debt in the only way he knew how, by shielding her with his very existence, just as she had shielded him from the unforgiving winter. He hadn't just made up a lie. He had told his version of the truth. The next morning, Redemption Gulch was a town holding its breath. Judge Grimshaw, after a sleepless night, was no closer to a solution. To dismiss the claim was to risk Ghost Bear's wrath. To accept it was to let a potential murderer walk free. He chose a third option, stall and try to publicly discredit the claim. The saloon was even more packed than before. Jane and Matawanagi were brought from the jail. This time, the judge ordered a chair be placed for him near Jane, making him an official, if unwelcome, part of the proceedings. The court has considered the unusual circumstances, Judge Grimshaw began. While this court does not officially recognize tribal unions, in the interest of avoiding misunderstanding, we are willing to hear you out. He fixed his gaze on Matawanagi. You claim this woman is your wife. When did this union take place? Matawanagi was silent for a moment. Time is measured by seasons, not by the numbers on your paper calendar. We were joined after the last winter. How convenient, Bartholomew Kane sneered. A secret wedding with no witnesses. There were witnesses, Matawanagi replied, his voice even. The sky was a witness. The earth was a witness. The Creator was a witness. These are the only ones that matter. The poetic answer clearly infuriated the judge. That is not an answer this court will accept. I'm talking about people. Did a preacher oversee this? A justice of the peace? Any white man at all? Your ways are not our ways, Matawanagi said simply. While the judge fumed, trying to trap him in a web of unfamiliar laws, Matawanagi's attention was elsewhere. His eyes were scanning the room, observing the men who had testified against Jane. He watched the Kane Ranch hands, noting their nervous swagger. He watched Bartholomew, seeing the venom and entitlement. And he watched Sheriff Hicks, with his worried expression, and his deputy, a quiet, weaselly man named Silas Reed, who stood by the door, his hand never far from his gun. And you claim you were with the defendant on the night of the murder? The judge pressed on, changing tactics. An alibi, is it? She was with me, Matawanagi stated. From sundown until the morning star was in the sky. Doing what? The question was lewd, intended to embarrass and discredit. Matawanagi's gaze finally snapped to the judge, a dangerous glint in his eyes. That is the business of a husband and wife. It is not for the ears of strangers. The simple, dignified reply left the judge speechless. He had tried to expose the claim as a sham, but the Lakota's unwavering calm made him seem more believable, not less. The proceedings droned on, a pointless exercise. The judge, getting nowhere, finally called for another recess. As Sheriff Hicks led them back to the jail, Matawanagi spoke to him, his voice low. I wish to see the place where the man was found. Hicks balked. Now why would I do that? It's a crime scene. The crime has already happened. The killer has not been found, Matawanagi countered. Perhaps you missed something. The implication was clear. Your investigation was incompetent. The sheriff, stung but also strangely intrigued, hesitated. Desperate for any break, he reluctantly agreed. Fine, but you'll be cuffed, and Deputy Reed will be with me. Leaving Jane locked in her cell, the three men rode out to the edge of Kane's property. The spot was marked by trampled grass and a dark stain on the soil. He was found right there, Hicks pointed. Shot from the direction of Finch's fence line, about 50 yards that way. Matawanagi dismounted. His cuffed hands didn't hinder him. He moved like a naturalist in his element, his eyes scanning not the obvious, but the periphery. He ignored the spot where the body had lain and instead walked the fence line, his gaze sweeping the ground. He's wasting our time, Brody, Deputy Silas Reed said nervously. What's he gonna find that we didn't? But Matawanagi had stopped. He knelt, his eyes fixed on a spot of disturbed dirt near the base of a fence post, the same post where Hicks claimed he found the .44 casing. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. Two men stood here, he said quietly. Not one. What are you talking about? The sheriff asked, walking over. The tracks are all gone. The wind takes the tracks from the flat ground first, Matawanagi explained, pointing with his chin. But here, beside the post, the grass holds the story. See? 2 sets of boot prints, faint. One with a worn heel, like yours, Sheriff. The other, different. Smaller, no spur mark. He then moved his gaze a few feet away, into a patch of thorny bushes. He stared into the tangle of branches for a long moment. Then he looked at Deputy Silas Reed. Your gun, Matawanagi said. It is a Colt, like the sheriff's. Silas stiffened. It's a Colt Peacemaker, standard issue. What's it to you? Matawanagi's eyes flickered back to the bush. A big gun, a soldier's gun. The man Kane was shot with a .44, a rifle bullet, you said. That's right, the sheriff confirmed. The casing we found. But a man does not always hunt with his biggest gun, Matawanagi mused, almost to himself. He stood up and took a step toward Silas Reed. The deputy instinctively took a step back, his face pale. A flicker of understanding, cold and sharp, ignited in Matawanagi's mind. He had seen fear in the saloon, but this was different. This wasn't the fear of a supernatural warrior. This was the fear of a liar, the fear of a guilty man. He turned to the sheriff. Let us go back, he said. I have seen enough. As they rode back to town, Matawanagi was silent, his face a stony mask. But behind his eyes, the pieces were falling into place. The easy accusation, the convenient evidence, the nervous deputy. The truth he was hunting was close. It was hiding in plain sight, right under the sheriff's nose. Back at the jail, Sheriff Hicks locked Matawanagi in his cell. What did you see? Jane whispered immediately. Did you find anything? A story, he replied, his voice a low murmur. The ground tells a story, if you know how to read it, but the story is not complete. He sat on the dirt floor, the epitome of patience. He knew the final piece of the puzzle would not be found in the dirt, but in the heart of a guilty man. And a guilty man, under pressure, always makes a mistake. The hours ticked by. Darkness fell. The sounds of the saloon grew louder, then faded. Through it all, Wanagi sat, watchful and silent. The mistake came just after midnight. The door to the jailhouse creaked open. A figure entered, carrying a lantern. It was Deputy Silas Reed. He didn't seem to notice that Wanagi was wide awake, watching him from the shadows. "Sheriff sent me," Silas mumbled, not looking at either of them. "To check the locks." He walked over to Jane's cell, his movements jerky. He fumbled with the key, his hand shaking. He wasn't checking the lock. He was testing it. Wanagi spoke, his voice soft but carrying in the stillness. "You are afraid of the dark, Deputy?" Silas jumped, startled. "I ain't afraid of nothing, just doing my job." "Your job is to protect the innocent," Wanagi said. "Is that what you are doing?" "She's not innocent," Silas snapped, his voice too loud, too defensive. "She killed him." Wanagi rose to his feet in a single fluid motion. "No. The boot prints by the fence told a different story. One man waiting, another arriving. They talk, they argue. Not a woman shooting from 50 yards away. Two men, standing close." Silas's face was slick with sweat in the lantern light. "You're crazy. You saw shadows." "I saw the truth," Wanagi continued, his voice relentless. "And I saw something else. In the thorn bush, something small and shiny." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Like a shell casing, but not from a rifle. Small, from a pocket gun, a gambler's gun, a Remington Derringer, perhaps." Every drop of color drained from Silas Reed's face. He stared, horrified. "Jedediah Kane owned you," Wanagi went on, his voice a low, damning whisper. "He held your gambling debts. He was threatening to expose you, to ruin you. So you agreed to meet him. You said you'd pay him back, but you didn't bring money. You brought a Derringer, hidden in your pocket. You argued, and you shot him. A coward's gun for a coward's murder." "No, no," Silas stammered, backing away. "Then you panicked. You knew they would suspect you. So you created a new story. You took a spent shell from your pocket, a .44 casing you picked up from target practice, and you dropped it by the fence on her land. You told the sheriff you found it there. You pointed the finger at the lonely woman, the perfect scapegoat." "Shut up!" Silas shrieked, his composure shattering. His hand dropped, not to his Colt, but to his vest pocket. It was an unconscious, damning reflex. He drew a small, silver-plated Remington Derringer. At that exact moment, the jailhouse door swung open again. Sheriff Brody Hicks stood there, his face grim. "I thought I might find you here, Silas. The Lakota. He told me to wait outside, and to listen." Silas Reed's world collapsed. He was trapped. With a desperate cry, he lunged, not at the sheriff or the Lakota, but at Jane's cell, jamming the Derringer between the bars, pointed directly at her. "Don't move, Brody. I'll kill her. I swear it." Everything happened in a heartbeat. Before the sheriff could even draw his weapon, Wanagi acted. With a powerful, explosive movement, he slammed his shoulder into his own cell door. The cheap iron lock, rusted and weak, burst from the wooden frame with a splintering crack. He was out. In 2 long strides, he crossed the narrow space. He didn't go for the gun. He grabbed Silas's wrist with one hand, twisting it with brutal efficiency. Bones snapped. The Derringer clattered to the floor. With his other hand, he slammed the deputy against the bars. The man's head hit the iron with a sickening thud. Silas crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. Sheriff Hicks stood with his Colt finally in his hand, looking down at the groaning form of his deputy, then at the broken cell door, and finally at Mato Wanagi, who stood over the fallen man, his expression as fierce and unforgiving as a winter storm. Jane was free. The truth, hunted and cornered, had finally been brought into the light. Not by law or order, but by the relentless gaze of a man who lived by a different code. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon with fingers of pale gold as two figures on horseback rode out of Redemption Gulch. They didn't look back. The town had nothing left for them. Jane Finch was cleared of all charges, her name now spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. Sheriff Hicks, shamed into action, had secured his deputy and begun the long process of writing a report that would omit as much of his own incompetence as possible. Jane rode the mule she had arrived with. Mato Wanagi rode a horse he had acquired. They hadn't spoken much. There were no words for the ordeal they had passed through. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice quiet in the vastness of the prairie. He looked towards the distant, hazy outline of the Black Hills, a sacred place for his people. "To the people," he said. "And you?" She looked at the endless horizon, a canvas of uncertainty and possibility. "I don't know. I can't go back to the homestead. Not now." She was still an outsider, now more than ever. He was silent for a time, watching the sun climb higher. "You saved my life," he said, not looking at her. "I paid the debt. The vow is fulfilled. You are free to go where you wish." She knew he was right. They were even. They owed each other nothing. And yet, leaving him, riding off in a different direction, felt wrong, impossible. They were bound by something deeper than a life debt. They were bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone, to be judged, and to survive against all odds. "The claim you made," she said softly. "In the saloon, you called me your wife." "It was a weapon made of words," he replied. "To protect you." "I know," she said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the small, intricately carved wooden feather he had given her. She held it out to him. "Is this just a weapon, too?" He stopped his horse and looked at the feather in her palm. He looked at her face, weathered by the sun and by hardship, at the strength in her eyes. He reached out, but not to take the feather. His fingers gently closed hers around it. "No," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "That is a promise, a new story, if you wish to help me write it." He did not smile, but the fierce severity in his eyes lessened, replaced by something else. An invitation, a question. Jane looked at the feather, then at the man beside her. She looked at the untamed land stretching out before them. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a threat, but like an open trail. She slipped the feather back into her pocket and nudged her mule forward, riding alongside him into the rising sun. She was no longer alone. And so the story of Jane Finch and the man they called Ghost Bear passed into the legends of the Old West. It wasn't a tale of grand romance, but something more real, more powerful, a story of a bond forged in secrets and sealed in defiance. It reminds us that sometimes justice isn't found in a courtroom, but in the courage of a single person who dares to stand against the crowd. It shows that in the harshest of lands, the greatest strength can come from the most unlikely of allies, and that a debt of honor is more binding than any law written on paper. Their journey forward was uncertain, but they faced it together. Two outsiders against the world, writing a new story in the dust of the American frontier. If this story from the untamed West captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend who appreciates tales of grit, justice, and the wild spirit of the frontier. And most importantly, Subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories from a time when legends weren't born, they were made.